The millionaire abducted a poor girl on the eve of her wedding. But on the next night, she learned. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. The rain poured down hard over the quiet town of Cedar Valley. The streets were slick with reflections of neon lights and headlights slicing through the night. Inside a tiny bridal shop at the corner of Maple Street, a young woman named Grace sat by the window, her hands trembling slightly as she finished sewing the last pearl on her wedding veil. The ceremony was less than 12 hours away. Her fiancé, a factory worker named Daniel, was kind, simple, and safe. Everything about her future was supposed to be predictable, maybe even dull, but steady. Grace exhaled, staring at her reflection in the glass. Her wedding dress was borrowed. Her shoes were secondhand. The entire ceremony had been funded by neighbors who loved her like family. She whispered to herself, "Tomorrow will be the start of a peaceful life." Outside, a black limousine slowed near the curb. A tall man stepped out, his dark coat whipping in the wind. He carried an umbrella but did not open it. His eyes fixed on the window where Grace Saturday. His name was Alexander Reed, heir to one of the largest real estate empires in the state. To the public, he was confident and untouchable. But tonight his expression was clouded with something else, desperation. Inside the shop, the lights flickered as thunder rolled. Grace turned to lock up for the night when the door suddenly pushed open. Water pooled at her feet as Alexander stepped inside, his presence filling the narrow room. "I am sorry, we are closed," Grace said, her voice polite but unsure. "I know," Alexander replied. His tone was low, measured. "But I need you to come with me." Grace froze. "What are you talking about? Who are you?" Alexander took a step forward, removing a folded document from his coat pocket. "My name is Alexander Reed. I do not have time to explain everything here, but I need your help. You are the only one who can save my family's company." She blinked, confused. "You must be mistaken. I'm getting married tomorrow." His jaw tightened. "That is exactly why I am here. I am asking you to marry me. Tonight." Grace laughed nervously, thinking it was some sort of cruel joke. "This is insane. You do not even know me." "I know enough," he said quietly. "You are honest, you are brave, and you remind me of someone I once trusted." Grace shook her head, backing toward the counter. "Please, leave. I am calling the police." Before she could reach her phone, Alexander laid the document on the counter. It was a contract typed, signed, and sealed. The words blurred before her eyes. Marriage agreement. Temporary term. Confidential. He looked at her again, his voice barely above a whisper. "If I do not have a wife by morning, I lose everything. My father's inheritance, my company, my employees' livelihoods. I will pay off all your debts and fund your family's future if you agree to help me." Grace stared at him, her heart pounding. The sound of the storm outside merged with the rhythm of her pulse. "You cannot be serious." "I am very serious," he said. "This is not about love. It is about survival. For both of us." Lightning flashed, illuminating his face. There was power in his posture, but behind his eyes, something fragile flickered fear. Grace's mind raced. Her mother's hospital bills were months overdue. The small diner where she worked was closing. And Daniel, sweet, loyal Daniel, deserved better than a life chained to her struggles. She whispered, "You are asking me to ruin everything I have left." Alexander's voice softened. "Or save something you have not even had a chance to live." For a long moment, the only sound was the rain. Then Grace slowly reached for the contract, her hand shaking. "If I say yes," she asked, "what happens next?" He met her eyes. "Then you become Mrs. Grace Reed before sunrise." The thunder cracked again as she signed her name, sealing the deal that would change both their lives forever. The storm had not stopped when Grace followed Alexander into the limousine. Her dress was damp, her fingers cold against the smooth leather seat. The city lights streaked past the tinted windows like ghosts of choices she could no longer undo. She sat in silence, gripping the folded contract in her lap as if it might vanish if she looked away. Alexander sat across from her, his posture straight, his jaw locked. He had offered her a clean towel and a cup of coffee, but she had refused both. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Finally, she asked in a quiet voice, "Why me? You could have asked anyone." Alexander turned his gaze toward her. "I did not have time to find anyone else. And because you are not part of my world, no one can accuse me of choosing a bride for profit. You are unexpected." Grace frowned, her heart pounding. "That is not an answer. You do not even know who I am." He sighed, resting his hands on his knees. "I know that you work at a small diner near 8th Avenue. I know that your mother's hospital bills are overdue. I know you have been struggling since your father passed away. I did my homework." Grace's stomach twisted. "So you investigated me?" I verified that you are honest," he replied evenly. "That is what I need tonight. Someone honest who can stand beside me when everything falls apart." The car turned onto a long private driveway lined with cypress trees. Through the fogged window, Grace saw the faint glow of a mansion perched on the hillside. She had never been near a place like it. The sight made her chest tighten with disbelief. When they arrived, Alexander stepped out first, offering his hand. She hesitated, then took it. The warmth of his palm startled her. It felt human, not like the cold image she had seen in magazines. Inside, the grand foyer smelled faintly of cedar and rain. A butler appeared, discreet and silent. "Everything is ready, Mr. Reed," he said. The man's tone held no surprise, as if midnight weddings were ordinary events in this house. Grace followed Alexander down a long marble corridor to a study lined with old books. A priest waited by the fireplace, his hands folded calmly. A document lay on the desk, beside two simple gold rings. Grace's voice trembled. "This is really happening." Alexander nodded. "It has to." Before the ceremony began, he turned to her one last time. "You can still say no. I will not stop you." Grace looked at the window. Beyond the glass, lightning flashed over the valley. "If I leave," she said softly, "my mother's treatment ends next week. She does not have another chance." He swallowed hard. "Then let us not waste any more time." The priest began speaking, his voice steady over the crackle of the fire. The words sounded unreal, distant, like lines from a dream she could not escape. "Do you, Alexander Reed, take Grace Miller to be your lawfully wedded wife?" When he said, "I do," it felt like thunder itself had paused to listen. Grace's turn came, and her lips formed the same words, though they burned as they left her mouth. The ceremony was over in minutes. A signature, a seal, a single photograph to confirm the union. Then, silence. Grace stood by the window, staring at her reflection. The white veil, the trembling hands, the ring that glimmered under the lamplight. It all looked like someone else's life. Alexander approached quietly. "I will transfer the funds for your mother's care first thing in the morning. You have my word." Grace nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He hesitated before adding, "You can stay in the West Wing tonight. Tomorrow we will appear before my father's board. They must believe this marriage is real. After that, we will discuss the terms of our arrangement." She turned toward him, her eyes wide. "Arrangement. That is all this is to you, is it not?" "Yes," he said, "at least for now." He left the room, his footsteps fading down the hall. Grace stood alone, her hand brushing the ring again. It felt heavy, not with gold, but with the weight of everything she had traded for it. Her dreams, her safety, her name. She whispered into the empty room, "What have I done?" Outside, the storm eased into a quiet drizzle. But inside her heart the thunder continued, slow and unrelenting, echoing the price of every choice she had made that night. The morning came with gray skies and the faint hum of rain against the tall windows of the Reed estate. Grace had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the flash of the priest's solemn face and the glint of the gold ring now circling her finger. It did not feel like jewelry. It felt like a shackle made of quiet promises and unspoken debts. When she finally stepped out of the guest room, the housekeeper, an older woman with kind eyes, greeted her with a polite nod. "Good morning, Mrs. Reed. Breakfast is served in the East Dining Room." Grace almost corrected her but stopped herself. Mrs. Reed. The title sounded foreign on her tongue, like a costume she had not earned the right to wear. She followed the woman through the grand hallway, her footsteps echoing off marble floors. Alexander was already seated at the long dining table, reading a document beside a cup of untouched coffee. The morning light carved sharp lines across his face, highlighting the exhaustion behind his calm exterior. He looked up when she entered. "Did you sleep at all?" "Not much," Grace admitted. "I kept wondering if this was all a dream." "Unfortunately," he said, folding the paper, "it is very real." The silence stretched between them until she asked, "What happens now?" Alexander leaned back, his voice firm but not unkind. "We have a board meeting in 2 hours. You will stand beside me, say little, and smile when necessary. The people there are sharks. If they sense weakness, they will devour everything my father built." Grace frowned. "And if they ask questions about us?" "Then you tell them we met through a charity event," he replied smoothly. "That we fell in love quickly, married privately, and will host a formal reception later. Keep it simple, no details, no hesitation." She stared at him, realizing just how carefully he had planned this. "You have done this before, haven't you?" His eyes darkened. "No, and I do not intend to again." The car ride to the city was long and silent. The estate gave way to crowded streets, flashing billboards, and glass towers that reached into the clouds. Grace pressed her hand against the window, watching her reflection blur against the skyline. A waitress from a small diner, now riding in a black car toward a boardroom full of millionaires. It felt unreal. When they arrived, cameras waited outside the headquarters of Reed & Company. Reporters shouted questions. Flashes burst like lightning. Grace hesitated, but Alexander placed his hand lightly on her back, guiding her forward. "Breathe," he murmured. "They can smell fear." Inside the lobby, everything gleamed marble, glass, chrome. Assistants hurried past, murmuring greetings. Grace kept her chin high, remembering his instructions. When they entered the meeting room, 12 executives looked up from their papers, their expressions polite but cold. Alexander introduced her. "This is my wife, Grace Reed." R. A murmur rippled through the room. One of the older board members, a man with silver hair, raised an eyebrow. "You married rather quickly, Alexander. The ink on your father's will is barely dry." Alexander smiled without warmth. "Life moves fast, Mr. Clayton." The meeting began, but Grace felt every pair of eyes on her. She focused on steady breathing, her hands folded neatly on her lap. She remembered the way Alexander had told her to act silent, poised, and unshaken. Halfway through, a young woman entered with a tray of coffee. She froze when she saw Grace. The expression that flashed across her face was unmistakable jealousy, disbelief. Grace realized with a chill that this must have been someone from Alexander's past. When the woman left, Grace whispered, "Who was that?" Alexander did not look at her. "Someone who no longer matters." After the meeting, they stepped into a quiet elevator. Grace finally exhaled, her nerves raw. That was terrifying. "Oh, you did well," he said simply. "Better than I expected." She turned toward him. "You really think this will work? That pretending to be married will save your company?" "It is not pretense to them," he replied. "Appearances are power. They see a stable family man, not a reckless heir. That image buys me time to secure what my father left behind." Grace shook her head slowly. "So I am just an image. A convenient lie." Alexander looked at her then, his eyes softening for the first time. "Maybe at first, but lies have a strange way of becoming truths when we repeat them long enough." The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. The sound felt final, like a curtain rising on a play neither of them had rehearsed for. By the time they returned to the car, the rain had stopped. The city lights shimmered on the wet pavement, reflecting their faces side by side in the glass. Grace looked at that reflection and saw two strangers bound by desperation, one by duty, the other by sacrifice. She whispered under her breath, "I do not belong in your world." Alexander glanced at her, his voice calm but distant. "Maybe not, but for now, you are part of it." And as the car rolled through the heart of the city, Grace realized that every mile forward was another step away from the life she once knew and deeper into the world of a man she barely understood. That evening, the mansion felt less like a home and more like a museum filled with portraits that watched her every move. Grace wandered through endless corridors, each one lined with chandeliers and polished floors that reflected her uncertainty. The morning had been a storm of cameras, questions, and judgmental glances. Now, the quiet felt even heavier. In her room, a stack of boxes waited on the bed. Inside were designer dresses, shoes, and jewelry gifts, meant to transform her into the wife of a millionaire. She ran her fingers over the silk fabric and felt a strange chill. None of it felt real. None of it felt like her. There was a knock on the door. Alexander stood there, no longer in his suit but in a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He looked less like the cold businessman she had seen that morning, and more like a man trying to remember how to breathe. "The stylist will arrive in an hour," he said. "We have a dinner tomorrow, with my father's associates. You will need to look the part." Grace nodded, still staring at the dresses. "And what part is that exactly? The part of a lie?" Alexander's expression tightened. "The part of survival. The board is watching. If they doubt this marriage, everything collapses." She looked up at him. "Do you ever get tired of pretending?" He hesitated, then answered softly. "Every single day." The next afternoon, Grace stood before the mirror while the stylist pinned her hair and adjusted the pearl earrings. The reflection, staring back at her, looked like a stranger, poised, elegant, untouchable. But her eyes betrayed the truth. Beneath the makeup and satin, fear still lived there. When she descended the staircase, Alexander was waiting at the bottom. His eyes flickered with something that almost looked like awe. For a brief moment the mask slipped, and he said quietly, "You look remarkable." "Thank you," she murmured. "You clean up well yourself." The dinner was held at a private restaurant overlooking the city skyline. Dozens of guests whispered as they entered, their curiosity sharp. Alexander kept his hand at the small of her back, guiding her through the sea of polished smiles and champagne glasses. "Mr. Reed," one of the guests said, "your wife is stunning. How long have you known each other?" Alexander smiled effortlessly. "Long enough to know she is the best decision I have ever made." Grace felt the warmth of his hand steady her as cameras flashed. For the first time, she played along with confidence, answering questions with calm grace. But beneath the table, her hands trembled. Midway through the dinner, a voice cut through the laughter. "I did not expect to see you again so soon, Alexander." "No." Grace turned to see the same woman from the boardroom, the one who had delivered the coffee. She was dressed in red, her smile sharp as a blade. "Clara," Alexander said carefully. "Enjoying the evening?" Clara's eyes drifted to Grace. "So, this is your new wife. I must say, you have a talent for surprises." Grace forced a polite smile. "It is nice to meet you." Clara leaned closer. "Careful, dear. Men like Alexander have a history of making promises they cannot keep." "Oh." Alexander's jaw clenched. "That is enough, Clara." The tension hung in the air. Guests glanced toward them, pretending not to stare. Grace managed to hold her composure, but inside her heart raced. When the dinner ended, Alexander guided her out into the cool night air. The city lights shimmered below like distant stars. "I am sorry about that," he said quietly. "Clara was a mistake. One I will not repeat." Grace crossed her arms. "I am not angry, but if this is the world you live in, then I need to learn how to survive in it." He looked at her, surprised. "You already are." For the first time since the wedding, Grace allowed herself a faint smile. Maybe she was not just a pawn in his plan. Maybe she could learn to navigate this world on her own terms. As they returned to the car, a thought crossed her mind. Pretending was exhausting, but for the first time, she wondered if it might lead her to something real. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the tall windows, warm and golden across the marble floor. Grace sat at the long breakfast table, a cup of untouched tea cooling in front of her. The night before had left her restless. The memory of Clara's sharp words still echoed in her mind, twisting with doubt. Alexander entered the room, already dressed for another meeting, his phone pressed to his ear. His voice was calm, confident, commanding every syllable perfectly controlled. When he finally hung up, he looked at Grace. "You did well last night," he said. "The board was pleased. They think you are perfect for the image we need." Grace forced a smile. "An image. That is what I am good for." He frowned slightly, setting the phone down. "Do not start this again. We both agreed on what this arrangement is." "An arrangement?" she repeated. "You say that word like it does not have a cost." Before he could answer, the butler entered with a silver tray. "Sir, the reporters are waiting outside. They have questions about the marriage certificate." Alexander's eyes narrowed. Let them wait. He turned to Grace. You will come with me. It is time you learned how to face them. Minutes later, they stepped outside the mansion gates, where flashes exploded like lightning. Microphones thrust forward, voices overlapping. Mr. Reed, is it true your marriage is fake? Mrs. Reed, how long have you known your husband? Grace froze for a moment, the chaos swallowing her. Then she remembered his words from the night before, appearances are power. She straightened her shoulders and smiled. My husband and I may not have a traditional story, but love is not a business contract. It is a promise, one we take seriously. Alexander looked at her, surprised. Her voice was steady, her eyes bright with quiet fire. The reporters murmured, taken aback by her poise. As they retreated into the car, Alexander spoke softly. You handled that better than most people in my world could. Grace met his gaze. Maybe because I do not belong in your world, I have nothing to lose. He hesitated, then said, You are wrong. You have everything to lose. That is what makes you dangerous. Later that day, they attended another corporate event, a charity luncheon for the company's foundation. Grace walked through the crowd of polished executives, offering polite smiles and practiced answers. Yet behind every handshake, she could feel their scrutiny. They were looking for cracks in the illusion. When the host asked her to speak, Alexander whispered, Keep it brief. Grace took the microphone anyway. I may not come from wealth, she began, her voice trembling slightly, but I believe compassion is the only true currency we have. My husband's foundation has changed lives, and I am honored to be a part of it. Applause filled the room. Grace caught Alexander's expression something between surprise and admiration. For the first time, the mask on his face faltered, and she saw gratitude beneath the steel. That night, back at the mansion, he stopped by her door. You impressed them all today. Grace looked up from the mirror where she had been removing her earrings. Did I impress you? He paused for a long moment. Yes, he said quietly. You did. Then he turned to leave. But not before she saw it, the flicker of something human, something fragile, breaking through the armor of his composure. And for the first time since their wedding, Grace wondered if beneath all the lies, there was a truth trying to find its way out. The days that followed moved like pages in a book Grace could not put down. The public appearances, the interviews, the constant performance, it all began to blend together. Yet somewhere between the handshakes and photographs, something had shifted. Alexander was still guarded, but now he looked at her differently, as if he could not decide whether she was his greatest risk or his only ally. One evening, after a long charity event, they returned to the mansion. The house was quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock in the hallway. Grace stopped by the grand piano, her fingers tracing the dust on the keys. Do you ever stop working? She asked without turning around. Alexander loosened his tie. Work keeps me from thinking too much. About what? He hesitated. About the people I lost. About my father. About what this company turned me into. Grace turned to face him. Maybe you should think about it more often. He gave a small, humorless laugh. You think reflection fixes everything? No, she said softly. But pretending you are made of stone does not help either. R.B. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Alexander stepped closer, his voice lower. You are not afraid of me, are you? She looked him straight in the eye. I was. Not anymore. That night, a thunderstorm rolled over the city. The rain tapped against the tall windows, steady and soft. Grace sat by the fireplace, reading through a pile of company files she had found on the desk. She wanted to understand his world, what he was fighting so hard to protect. When Alexander walked in, he looked surprised. You are reading financial reports? I am trying to learn, she said. If I am going to play your wife, I might as well know what I am defending. He smiled faintly. You really are full of surprises. She met his gaze. You said the board members were like sharks. Maybe it is time they realized your wife has teeth, too. He laughed quietly, the sound genuine for once. It was the first time she had seen him truly relax. Later, as the storm softened, they sat across from each other in front of the fire. The flicker of the flames reflected in his eyes, and something unspoken hung in the air. Grace broke the silence first. When you are not fighting to save the company, what do you want? Alexander stared into the fire. Peace, he said simply. The kind that does not depend on contracts or balance sheets. I cannot remember the last time I had that. She nodded. Maybe you just have to stop searching for it in the wrong places. He looked at her, studying her face. And where should I look instead? Grace felt her heart tighten, but she smiled faintly. You will figure it out. As she rose to leave, Alexander reached out, catching her hand. His touch was hesitant but warm. Grace, he said quietly, for what it is worth, thank you. You have done more for me than you know. Oh, for a moment, she saw him not as the powerful businessman who had forced her into a contract, but as a man who had forgotten how to trust. When she finally pulled her hand away and walked toward the door, her heart raced in a way she could not explain. The arrangement had started as a performance, but the lines between act and truth were beginning to blur. That night, as the thunder faded in the distance, Grace lay awake staring at the ceiling. She realized the strangest thing of all: she no longer felt trapped. For the first time since that stormy night in the bridal shop, she did not just belong to his world. She was part of it. The calm between them did not last long. A few days later, Grace woke to the sound of raised voices echoing through the hall. She hurried downstairs to find Alexander standing in the foyer, his expression hard as glass. Across from him stood Clara, the woman in red from the dinner party. Her smile was sharp, her words colder than the marble floor beneath them. I told you this would happen, Clara said. You think the board does not have eyes everywhere? They already know the truth. Your little marriage act will not save you this time. Alexander's jaw tightened. Get out of my house. Clara laughed, turning toward Grace. You should ask your husband why he really needed a wife so suddenly. It was not just about inheritance. It was about covering up the fact that his company was already drowning. Grace felt the color drain from her face. What is she talking about? Alexander looked at her, but the answer came too slow. That hesitation was all Clara needed. She tossed a manila envelope onto the floor. There are copies of your marriage license and the timestamp. It was filed after the legal deadline for his father's will. That means it is invalid. Congratulations, Mrs. Reed. You are not even legally his wife. Oh. The door slammed behind Clara as she walked out into the rain. Silence fell. Grace stared at the papers scattered across the marble. The ink bled slightly where the water touched them. She turned to Alexander, her voice trembling. Is it true? He hesitated again. I did what I had to do. You lied to me. I protected us, he said sharply. If the board had known the truth sooner, they would have destroyed everything. I needed time. Grace shook her head. You needed control. Ope. He stepped forward. You do not understand what this world is like. Every choice I make has consequences. Her eyes filled with tears, but her voice grew steadier. So does mine. I gave up everything to help you. My mother's dignity, my own freedom, my future. And now you are telling me it was never real? Alexander's expression cracked, just slightly. Grace, I never meant to hurt you. I thought I could fix this before it got to you. But you did hurt me, she said quietly. You used me. For the first time since she met him, he had no answer. Grace turned away, her vision blurring. The world that had once looked so polished now felt hollow. The chandeliers, the marble, the gold, none of it mattered. She needed air. She needed space to think. She left the mansion, ignoring the rain that soaked through her clothes. The cold bit at her skin, but it was nothing compared to the ache in her chest. Inside, Alexander stood motionless, staring at the door she had just walked through. The contract on his desk, once a symbol of control, now felt like a chain around his own heart. Outside, Grace kept walking until the lights of the estate disappeared behind her. For the first time in weeks, she was free, but it did not feel like freedom. It felt like loss. As thunder rolled in the distance, she whispered to herself. He promised it was survival, but maybe it was only greed. And somewhere deep inside that mansion of secrets, Alexander realized that everything he had built to protect his empire had just cost him the only person who had ever truly seen him. Rain had turned the streets of the city into rivers of silver. Grace walked without direction, her thoughts scattered like leaves in the storm. She ended up at the small diner where she used to work, the place that had once smelled of coffee and warmth. It was nearly empty now, just a few late-night customers and the hum of an old jukebox in the corner. The owner, Mrs. Harris, looked up in surprise. "Grace Miller. Is that really you?" Grace managed a weak smile. "It is still me, I think." Mrs. Harris poured her a cup of coffee. "I saw you on television, sweetheart. Married to that businessman. What on earth are you doing back here, looking like the rain dragged you home?" Grace stared into the dark coffee. "Because maybe it did." "Oh." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Mrs. Harris reached across the counter. "You were never the kind of girl to give up. Whatever happened, you will figure it out." Grace nodded, though her chest still felt heavy. She stayed there until dawn, watching the rain fade into a soft gray morning. She knew what she had to do. Back at the Reed estate, Alexander had not slept. The board had called an emergency meeting, demanding an explanation. Clara's documents had spread across the internet, and rumors of fraud were everywhere. His company's stock was falling, and his name was being dragged through the mud. But none of it hurt as much as the silence in his house, the absence of Grace's footsteps, her voice, her stubborn honesty. By mid-morning, reporters surrounded the gates again. Alexander walked past them without a word and drove straight to the diner. When he stepped inside, soaked from the rain, Grace looked up from her table. Her eyes were tired but clear. "You should not be here," she said quietly. "Maybe not," he replied, "but I needed to see you." She folded her hands. "You lied to me, Alexander. You made me believe this marriage meant something when it was only a strategy." He nodded. "You are right. I was desperate. I thought I could control everything, even you. But when you left, I realized I had already lost everything that mattered." Grace looked away, blinking back tears. "You do not get to fix this with apologies." "I know," he said. "That is why I am not asking for forgiveness. I am asking for a chance to make it right." She frowned. "And how do you plan to do that?" Alexander took a deep breath. "By telling the truth. To the board. To the media. To everyone. I will admit what I did. I will step down if I have to." Grace stared at him, disbelief and hope fighting inside her. "You would ruin everything you built?" "I already did," he said softly. "This company was built on my father's pride, but it will not survive without honesty. You taught me that." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she whispered, "If you do this, you will lose everything." He met her gaze. "Maybe not everything." The next day, Alexander stood before the cameras at the company headquarters. Grace watched from the crowd as he spoke. His voice was steady, his confession complete. He admitted to falsifying the marriage license, to manipulating the board, to losing sight of integrity. When the speech ended, the room was silent. Then, one by one, people began to applaud not for his power, but for his honesty. Alexander stepped down from the podium and found Grace waiting near the exit. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he said, "I kept my promise. I told the truth." She nodded slowly. "You did." The storm had passed, but the air between them still trembled with everything unspoken. Pain, forgiveness, and something fragile that might one day become love. Weeks passed before the noise of the scandal began to fade. The newspapers had moved on to newer stories, and the city that once whispered about Alexander Reed now barely remembered the chaos. But inside the Reed estate, something had changed forever. The silence that used to feel like power now felt like peace. Grace stood in the garden one afternoon, trimming the white roses that bloomed along the stone path. The sun was warm on her skin, and for the first time in months, her hands did not shake. She had chosen to stay not because of the mansion, not because of the wealth, but because she wanted to see who Alexander would become without the mask. Behind her, footsteps approached. Alexander stopped a few feet away, his sleeves rolled up, his tie gone. There was no trace of the man who once barked orders and calculated every move. "I did not think you would come back to the garden," he said softly. Grace smiled faintly. "You always said this place was a waste of space. I wanted to prove you wrong." He nodded, looking at the flowers she had revived. "You did more than that. You brought life back into a house that was only built for appearances." She met his eyes. "And what about you? Have you found your peace?" He hesitated, then said, "I am still learning, but I know I cannot buy it. I have to earn it." Grace set the pruning shears down and turned to face him. "You already took the first step when you told the truth." Alexander took a deep breath, reaching into his pocket. He held out a small velvet box. Inside was a ring not extravagant, but simple and beautiful, a single diamond set in gold. "This time," he said, "no contracts, no deadlines, no lies. Just a promise. Will you marry me for real?" Grace stared at the ring, her heart beating faster. "You know this does not erase the past." "I do," he said, "but maybe it can build a future." For a moment, the world felt still, the birds, the breeze, even the distant hum of the city. Grace looked at him, saw the honesty in his eyes, and nodded. "Yes," she whispered, "but only if we build it together." Alexander smiled, slipping the ring onto her finger. "Together," he said. The sunlight caught the diamond as they stood side by side in the garden. The storm that had once brought them together had finally cleared, leaving only calm skies above. And as the camera of fate pulled back on their story, one truth remained: what began as a contract born of desperation had become a love founded on redemption, honesty, and the courage to start again.